When most people hear the word addiction, a very specific image comes to mind. They think of drugs, alcohol, gambling, or some other obvious dependency. They imagine a person whose life is visibly falling apart, someone trapped by a habit they can no longer control. Because of this image, most people immediately assume addiction is something that happens to other people. It belongs to a different category of human experience, something separate from ordinary life. But what if that assumption is completely wrong? What if addiction is far more common than anyone realizes? What if some of the most powerful addictions are so deeply woven into everyday life that they appear normal? What if millions of people are living under the influence of addictions they don't even recognize as addictions? Imagine a person who never drinks alcohol, never uses drugs, avoids gambling, exercises regularly, and appears completely responsible. From the outside, they seem healthy and in control. Yet, every morning they wake up and immediately reach for their phone. They constantly check notifications. They need reassurance from other people. They replay old conversations in their head. They worry about the future. They compare themselves to strangers online. They become angry over opinions that have no direct impact on their lives. They spend years trapped in the same emotional patterns, repeating the same mental habits again and again. Will we call this addiction? Most people wouldn't, but perhaps they should. The truth is that addiction is not defined by the object. It is defined by the relationship. Addiction occurs whenever a person repeatedly returns to something despite the negative consequences. It occurs whenever a behavior begins controlling the individual instead of serving them. It occurs whenever a temporary feeling becomes something the mind believes it cannot live without. Once you understand this, a disturbing possibility begins to emerge. People can become addicted to attention, addicted to validation, addicted to worry, addicted to outrage, addicted to being right, addicted to drama, addicted to suffering. At first, this sounds absurd. Why would anyone become addicted to things that make them unhappy? Why would someone repeatedly choose emotional pain? Why would they return to the same destructive patterns year after year? Yet human beings do exactly that. People remain trapped in relationships that hurt them. They continue habits that drain them. They repeat thoughts that make them miserable. They cling to identities that limit them. They revisit memories that cause pain. They feed fears that never become reality. And they do it so consistently that it begins to feel natural. The reason is simple. The mind does not always choose what is good for you. The mind often chooses what is familiar. Familiarity creates comfort. Comfort creates attachment. Attachment creates dependence. And dependence eventually becomes addiction. This is what makes psychological addiction so dangerous. Unlike substances, psychological addictions hide behind personality. They disguise themselves as normal behavior. A person addicted to worry calls it responsibility. A person addicted to validation calls it confidence. A person addicted to outrage calls it being informed. A person addicted to victimhood calls it honesty. The addiction becomes so closely connected to identity that the person mistakes it for who they are. And you cannot escape something you believe you are. This is why so many people struggle to change. They are not fighting against a habit. They are fighting against an identity. They're trying to let go of something their mind has spent years convincing them is necessary for survival. The journey toward freedom begins with seeing the truth clearly, not judging it, not fighting it, simply seeing it. Because the moment you become aware of an addiction, the addiction loses part of its power. The moment you recognize a pattern, you stop confusing it with yourself. And the moment you stop identifying with it, a door begins to open. A door that most people never realize exists. Because the most dangerous addictions are never the obvious ones. They are the invisible ones, the ones hiding inside the mind. And those are the addictions we are about to explore. Most people spend their lives looking for freedom while remaining completely unaware of the forces controlling them. The reason is not that these forces are particularly powerful. The reason is that they are familiar. Human beings have an extraordinary ability to normalize almost anything. Given enough time, even unhealthy patterns begin to feel natural. Consider validation. Nearly everyone enjoys receiving approval. Compliments feel good. Recognition feels rewarding. Being accepted by a group provides a sense of belonging. These experiences are completely normal. They are part of being human. The problem begins when validation stops being something you enjoy and starts becoming something you need. Many people cannot feel good about themselves unless someone else confirms their value. Their confidence depends on praise. Their self-worth depends on approval. Their mood depends on how others perceive them. Without realizing it, they have handed control of their emotional state to the outside world. This creates a cycle that is nearly impossible to satisfy. Approval provides temporary relief, but the relief never lasts. Eventually, the mind needs more. More praise, more recognition, more reassurance, more evidence that it is worthy. The result is a person who spends their entire life chasing something they can never permanently obtain. Social media has transformed this tendency into one of the largest psychological addictions in history. Every notification acts like a reward. Every like becomes a form of validation. Every comment becomes a small emotional stimulus. People begin checking their phones not because they need information, but because they are unconsciously seeking reassurance. The platforms understand this perfectly. Entire industries are built around capturing attention and keeping it. The longer a person remains engaged, the more valuable they become. As a result, modern technology is designed to exploit psychological vulnerabilities that humans have carried for thousands of years. This leads directly into another addiction that receives far less attention than it deserves: the addiction to stimulation. Most people are uncomfortable being alone with their thoughts. The moment silence appears, they reach for something: a phone, a video, music, a conversation, a notification, anything that prevents stillness. Try sitting in a quiet room for 20 minutes without any distractions. No phone, no music, no television, no conversation, just silence. For many people, this feels surprisingly difficult. The mind immediately begins searching for stimulation. It wants something to consume, something to react to, something to think about. The constant need for stimulation has become so normalized that many people cannot remember what mental stillness feels like. This addiction to stimulation creates another problem. It weakens attention. Every time focus shifts from one thing to another, the mind becomes less capable of remaining present. Over time, people lose the ability to engage deeply with anything. Books become difficult to read. Conversations become harder to follow. Moments become easier to miss. Life begins feeling fragmented because attention itself has become fragmented. Then there is the addiction to worry. This one is particularly dangerous because it disguises itself as responsibility. Many people genuinely believe that worrying helps them. They assume that constantly thinking about potential problems makes them more prepared. But if worry actually solved problems, chronic worriers would be the most peaceful people on earth. Instead, they're often the most exhausted. Worry creates the illusion of control. It makes people feel as though they're doing something productive, even when they're simply recycling the same fears. The mind becomes trapped in endless loops of prediction. It imagines scenarios, analyzes outcomes, and prepares for disasters that may never happen. The future remains uncertain regardless. Yet, the habit continues because the mind mistakes mental activity for progress. Another addiction hiding in plain sight is the addiction to outrage. This addiction has become increasingly common in the digital age. People consume information not because they want understanding, but because they want emotional stimulation. Outrage provides that stimulation instantly. Anger feels powerful. Righteousness feels powerful. Moral superiority feels powerful. The problem is that outrage is exhausting. It keeps the nervous system in a constant state of tension. It transforms every disagreement into a battle. It encourages people to seek enemies rather than understanding. And yet many people return to it every day. Not because it makes them happy, because it makes them feel alive. There is also an addiction that is even more subtle, the addiction to being right. Most people believe they want truth. In reality, many people want confirmation. They want evidence that supports what they already believe. They want validation for their existing worldview. They want the comfort of certainty. Being wrong threatens identity. Being right protects identity. As a result, the ego becomes deeply attached to its opinions. Conversations stop being opportunities to learn and become opportunities to win. Curiosity disappears. Defensiveness takes its place. The addiction is not to knowledge. The addiction is to certainty. Perhaps the most destructive addiction of all is the addiction to victimhood. This does not mean that people do not experience genuine hardship. Everyone faces challenges. Everyone experiences pain. Everyone encounters unfairness at some point in life. The problem arises when suffering becomes identity. When a person begins defining themselves through what happened to them, they become psychologically attached to the story. The story provides certainty. It explains their struggles. It gives meaning to their pain. Eventually, letting go of the story feels like losing a part of themselves. So they continue repeating it, again and again, year after year, not because they enjoy suffering, because the identity built around suffering has become familiar, and familiarity feels safe. This is the hidden thread connecting every psychological addiction. They all provide something. Validation provides approval. Worry provides the illusion of control. Outrage provides stimulation. Victimhood provides identity. Certainty provides comfort. The addiction survives because it appears useful. But usefulness and freedom are not the same thing. A cage can feel comfortable. That does not make it freedom. And the first step toward freedom is recognizing the cage. Most people never do. They spend their entire lives feeding patterns they claim they want to escape. They strengthen habits they wish would disappear. They reinforce identities that keep them trapped. Not because they are weak, because they are unconscious of what is happening. But awareness changes everything. The moment you see the pattern clearly, you begin separating yourself from it. You stop saying, "This is who I am," and start saying, "This is something I experience." That small shift changes the entire game. Because once the addiction is seen, it can no longer hide. And what can no longer hide eventually begins to lose its power. If psychological addictions are so destructive, an obvious question appears. Why do people keep returning to them? Why would someone repeatedly choose worry over peace? Why would they remain trapped in the same emotional patterns year after year? Why would they continue feeding habits that make them unhappy? The answer is more uncomfortable than most people expect. Because these patterns are not random. They serve a purpose. The human mind does not hold on to something for no reason. Even destructive behaviors usually provide some hidden benefit. The benefit may be unconscious. It may be temporary. It may ultimately create more pain than relief. But as long as the mind believes the benefit outweighs the cost, the pattern survives. This is where the ego enters the story. The ego is not an enemy. It is not some evil force hiding inside the mind. It is simply the identity you have built throughout your life. It is the collection of beliefs, memories, experiences, labels, successes, failures, and stories that create your sense of self. The ego answers the question, "Who am I?" The problem is that many of the answers people give to that question are built around suffering. Some people define themselves by rejection. Others define themselves by failure. Others define themselves by hardship. Others define themselves by being misunderstood. Others define themselves by what happened to them years ago. Over time, these stories become so familiar that they stop feeling like stories. They begin feeling like reality. A person who has spent years believing they are unlucky starts finding evidence everywhere that life is unfair. A person who believes they're not good enough begins interpreting every situation through that lens. A person who believes people cannot be trusted starts seeing betrayal around every corner. The story shapes perception. Perception shapes experience. Experience reinforces the story, and the cycle continues. What makes this cycle so powerful is that the ego values familiarity more than happiness. Most people assume the mind wants peace. That is not entirely true. The mind wants certainty, and certainty can exist inside suffering just as easily as it can exist inside happiness. Imagine a person who has spent 20 years feeling insecure. Their insecurity is painful. It limits their life. It creates anxiety. It damages relationships. Yet it is familiar. The insecurity has become part of their identity. If that insecurity suddenly disappeared tomorrow, they would not only gain freedom, they would also lose something. They would lose a story they have carried for years. As strange as it sounds, many people fear freedom because freedom requires uncertainty. Freedom means stepping into the unknown, and the ego hates the unknown. This is why people often sabotage their own progress. Someone begins building confidence, then suddenly returns to self-doubt. Someone enters a healthy relationship, then creates unnecessary conflict. Someone starts making progress toward a goal, then procrastinates until momentum disappears. From the outside, these behaviors appear irrational. From the perspective of the ego, they make perfect sense. The ego is attempting to return to what is familiar, even if what is familiar is painful. This is one of the deepest truths about human psychology. People do not always seek happiness. People seek familiarity, and familiarity can become an addiction. Think about how often people repeat the same emotional experiences with different faces and different circumstances. One person leaves a toxic relationship only to enter another one. A different person leaves a stressful job only to create stress somewhere else. Someone escapes one source of conflict and unconsciously creates a new one. The details change. The pattern remains, because the pattern lives inside the person, not the situation. The external world becomes a stage where the same internal story keeps playing. This is why some people seem to attract drama wherever they go. It is not because the universe is targeting them. It is because drama has become familiar. Without drama, they feel restless. Without conflict, they feel bored. Without problems, they feel uncomfortable. Peace feels unfamiliar, and anything unfamiliar feels threatening. Many people claim they want peace, but what they actually want is excitement without discomfort. The problem is that they have become so accustomed to emotional intensity that stillness feels empty. When nothing dramatic is happening, they begin searching for something. A new conflict, a new worry, a new fear, a new problem. Anything that recreates the emotional environment they have become addicted to. This is one reason social media has become so powerful. It delivers endless emotional stimulation. Every scroll offers outrage, comparison, validation, fear, excitement, judgment. The mind never has to sit in stillness because there is always another emotional hit available. And like any addiction, the effects weaken over time. The mind needs more stimulation to achieve the same result. More scrolling, more content, more outrage, more distraction, more noise. Eventually, silence begins to feel unbearable. But silence is precisely where freedom begins. Because in silence, the patterns become visible. When the distractions disappear, the mind can no longer hide from itself. This is why so many people avoid being alone. Being alone means facing the stories they have been running from. The stories about who they are. The stories about what they deserve. The stories about what is possible. The stories about what happened years ago. Most people spend enormous amounts of energy protecting these stories. At this point, a question naturally arises. If psychological addictions are built through repetition, reinforced through identity, and strengthened by years of unconscious behavior, how does a person actually break free? Most people immediately look for techniques. They want a strategy, a method, a shortcut, something they can do tomorrow that will permanently solve the problem. But real change rarely works that way. The reason so many people fail to overcome their addictions is because they focus entirely on the behavior while ignoring the source of the behavior. They try to remove the symptom without understanding the mechanism that keeps creating it. Imagine a plant with poisonous leaves. Every day you cut the leaves off. For a moment, it looks like progress. The problem appears smaller. But eventually the leaves return because the roots remain untouched. This is how most people approach change. They focus on the visible behavior, the scrolling, the worrying, the comparison, the need for validation, the emotional reactions, the distractions, but the roots remain hidden. And until the roots are understood, the pattern simply finds another form. A person quits social media and becomes addicted to news. A person escapes one toxic relationship and enters another. A person stops worrying about one problem and immediately finds something new to worry about. The addiction changes shape. The underlying mechanism survives. This is why awareness is so important. Awareness works differently from willpower. Willpower attempts to force change. Awareness creates understanding, and understanding reaches deeper than force ever can. Think about a magic trick. As long as you don't understand how the trick works, it appears powerful. It captures your attention. It controls your perception. It creates the illusion of something impossible. Then someone explains the trick. Suddenly, the magic disappears. The trick itself has not changed. Your understanding has. And that understanding changes your relationship to what you are seeing. Psychological addictions operate in a similar way. As long as they remain unconscious, they control you. Once they become visible, their power begins to fade. This does not mean they disappear overnight. Patterns built over years rarely vanish in a single moment. But awareness creates something that addiction cannot survive without. Choice. Addiction thrives on automation. It depends on unconscious repetition. The pattern wants you to react before you become aware of what is happening. It wants the process to remain invisible, because invisibility is its greatest source of power. The moment awareness enters the process, the automatic nature begins to weaken. For example, imagine you catch yourself reaching for your phone out of habit. In the past, the action happened automatically. You felt bored. You grabbed the phone. You opened an app. You scrolled. You reacted. The process happened so quickly that you never questioned it. Now, imagine something different happens. You feel the urge, but instead of immediately acting, you notice it. You observe the impulse. You become curious about it. For a brief moment, there is a gap between the urge and the action. That gap is incredibly important, because within that gap exists freedom. Not complete freedom, not permanent freedom, but the beginning of freedom. Most people believe freedom means having no impulses. In reality, freedom means not being controlled by every impulse that appears. The urge may still exist. The thought may still appear. The emotional reaction may still arise. But now there is awareness, and awareness creates choice. This principle applies far beyond obvious addictions. It applies to anger. Someone says something you dislike. The reaction appears immediately. In the past, the reaction controlled behavior. Now awareness notices it. The anger is still present, but there is space around it. The reaction no longer owns you completely. The same thing happens with worry. A fearful thought enters the mind. Normally, it would trigger an endless chain of overthinking. Now awareness notices the thought before the chain fully develops. Again, there is space. And within that space, the cycle begins losing momentum. This is why awareness is often described as transformative. Not because it changes reality, because it changes your relationship with reality. And relationships determine experience. Imagine holding a heavy object in your hand. At first, it feels manageable. As time passes, it becomes exhausting. Eventually, your arm begins to ache. Most people spend years carrying psychological burdens the same way. Old fears, old identities, old stories, old addictions. They carry them for so long that they forget they are carrying them. Then one day, awareness asks a simple question. What happens if you put it down? For many people, this question feels frightening because they have carried the burden for so long that they no longer know who they are without it. Who are you without the constant worry? Who are you without the need for approval? Who are you without the story of being unlucky? Who are you without the identity built around suffering? These questions can feel uncomfortable because they challenge everything familiar. Yet hidden inside them is the possibility of freedom. The possibility that the things you have been carrying are not actually you. The possibility that the addiction is not your identity. The possibility that the story is not your identity. The possibility that the fear is not your identity. The possibility that awareness exists before all of them. This realization changes everything. Because once you stop identifying the pattern loses its deepest source of power. Identity is fuel. Attention is fuel. Repetition is fuel. Without those things, psychological addictions begin to weaken naturally. This does not require fighting. It does not require self-hatred. It does not require constant struggle. In fact, struggle often keeps the addiction alive. The more you obsess over the pattern, the more attention you give it. The more attention you give it, the stronger it becomes. Awareness takes a different approach. Awareness simply sees. It notices. It understands. It remains present, and presence changes the entire dynamic. Imagine sitting beside a river. Leaves float past on the surface of the water. Some are large, some are small. Some move quickly, some move slowly. You do not chase them. You do not fight them. You simply watch them pass. Thoughts are similar. Emotions are similar. Urges are similar. Most people jump into the river and allow every passing leaf to carry them away. Awareness stays on the shore. It watches. It notices. It remains present. And because it remains present, it remains free. This is what many people misunderstand about freedom. Freedom is not the absence of thoughts. Freedom is not the absence of emotion. Freedom is not the absence of difficulty. Freedom is the absence of unconscious obedience. The thought appears. You notice it. The emotion appears. You notice it. The urge appears. You notice it. And in that noticing, something profound begins to happen. The addiction loses its authority. The pattern loses its grip. The identity begins to soften. For the first time, you realize that awareness is larger than any habit you have ever developed, larger than any story you have ever believed, larger than any addiction you have ever carried. And when that realization becomes clear, life begins to change in unexpected ways. Not because the world changes. The world remains imperfect. Challenges remain. Uncertainty remains. Problems remain. But the relationship changes. And when the relationship changes, the experience changes. The person who once needed constant validation begins finding confidence within themselves. The person who once lived through worry begins discovering trust. The person who once depended on drama begins appreciating peace. The person who once felt trapped begins seeing possibilities. The external world may appear similar. Internally, everything feels different. This is the paradox that most people spend their lives missing. They search for freedom in circumstances, but freedom begins in awareness. They search for peace in outcomes, but peace begins in presence. They search for themselves in achievements, but the self they are looking for exists before achievement ever arrives. Because beneath every addiction, every identity, every fear, every story, there is something that has been present the entire time. The observer, the awareness that notices, the awareness that watches, the awareness that remains unchanged while experiences come and go. Most people spend their lives looking for freedom somewhere in the future. Yet freedom becomes available the moment they stop feeding what keeps them trapped. The moment they stop feeding the need for validation. The moment they stop feeding the addiction to worry. The moment they stop feeding the endless search for certainty. The moment they stop feeding the stories that define them. Because every addiction survives on attention. Every addiction survives on repetition. Every addiction survives on identification. Remove those things, and the addiction begins to starve. Slowly, quietly, naturally, until one day you realize something remarkable. The thing that once controlled your life no longer has the same power. The pattern still appears from time to time, but now you see it, and what is seen clearly can no longer dominate in the same way. That is the beginning of true freedom. Not freedom from life, freedom within life. The freedom to experience without becoming trapped. The freedom to feel without becoming lost. The freedom to think without becoming consumed. The freedom to live without being controlled by invisible addictions. And perhaps that is the greatest discovery of all. The person you have been searching for was never hidden. They were simply buried beneath years of unconscious patterns. The addictions, the fears, the stories, the identities. One by one, they begin to fall away. And what remains is something that was always there. Something quiet, something aware, something free. The most dangerous addiction isn't what you think. Because the most dangerous addiction is the one that convinces you it is you. And the moment you realize it isn't, everything changes. For most of human history, survival depended on paying attention to danger. The individuals who noticed threats were more likely to survive than those who ignored them. As a result, the human brain evolved to prioritize negative information. It learned to scan the environment for problems. It learned to focus on risks. It learned to remember pain more vividly than pleasure. This ability once protected our ancestors. Today, however, it often works against us. The modern world is safer than almost any period in human history. Most people are not running from predators. They are not fighting for survival every day. Yet the machinery of the mind remains the same. The brain continues searching for threats because searching for threats is what it was designed to do. When real dangers are scarce, the mind begins creating psychological ones. A future that has not happened. A conversation that has not occurred. A rejection that exists only in imagination. A failure that may never arrive. The mind becomes occupied by possibilities rather than realities. This is where another addiction emerges. The addiction to certainty. Human beings crave certainty because certainty creates the illusion of safety. We want to know what will happen tomorrow. We want guarantees. We want assurances that everything will work out exactly as planned. Life offers none of these things. Life is uncertain by nature. No amount of thinking can remove that uncertainty. No amount of worrying can eliminate it. No amount of planning can fully control it. Yet the mind keeps trying. It keeps searching for answers that do not exist. It keeps demanding certainty from a reality that cannot provide it. And because certainty never arrives, the search continues indefinitely. Many people spend their entire lives trapped in this cycle. They believe that one more thought will finally solve everything. One more plan, one more analysis, one more prediction, one more attempt to control the future. But the future remains unknown. The addiction survives because the mind mistakes certainty for safety. In reality, true freedom begins when a person becomes comfortable with uncertainty. Not because uncertainty is pleasant, but because it is real. The moment you stop demanding certainty from life, a tremendous amount of psychological pressure disappears. You no longer need every answer. You no longer need every outcome guaranteed. You no longer need complete control. You begin meeting life as it is rather than constantly demanding it become something else. This shift changes everything. Because the deepest addiction is not validation. It is not attention. It is not outrage. It is not even suffering. The deepest addiction is control. The desire to control circumstances. The desire to control people. The desire to control outcomes. The desire to control the future. And yet the harder people try to control everything, the more anxious they become. Because reality refuses to cooperate. Life continues changing. People continue surprising us. Situations continue evolving. The future continues remaining uncertain. The addiction to control creates endless resistance against the natural flow of life. This is why letting go feels so powerful. Not because you stop caring, not because you become passive, but because you stop fighting battles that can never be won. You stop demanding certainty from uncertainty. You stop demanding permanence from impermanence. You stop demanding control over things that were never yours to control. And in that surrender, a strange thing happens. Peace begins to emerge. Not the peace that comes from getting everything you want. The peace that comes from no longer needing everything to happen your way. Most people spend their lives believing freedom comes from gaining more control. The opposite is often true. Freedom comes from recognizing how little control was ever necessary. When you stop feeding the addiction to control, you stop feeding fear. When you stop feeding fear, you stop feeding suffering. When you stop feeding suffering, the mind becomes quieter. And in that quietness, something extraordinary reveals itself. You were never as trapped as you believed. The prison existed primarily in thought. The chains existed primarily in identification. The addiction survived primarily through attention. Once attention is withdrawn, the structure begins collapsing on its own. Not overnight, not instantly, but inevitably, because what is no longer fed cannot continue growing. And perhaps that is the most important realization of all. You do not need to become someone new. You do not need to create freedom. You do not need to manufacture peace. You simply need to stop feeding the things that obscure them. Because beneath every addiction, every fear, every story, and every identity, there has always been something untouched, something aware, something present, something free. And the moment you discover it, you realize that freedom was never somewhere in the future. It was waiting beneath the noise the entire time.